Episode 9. Other flags. The flight landed at Tegel at 6:14 a.m., and Renn sat in the terminal for 22 minutes before she cleared customs. The queue moved through a man in a fluorescent vest directing foot traffic, two agents at the booths behind smudged glass, a long, low hallway that smelled of floor wax and recycled air, and the specific exhaustion of 100 people who had been sitting in seats too small for 7 hours. She moved through it in the way she always moved through airports. Deliberate. No hesitation at the booth, no eye contact beyond what was required. The passport she carried said a different name. The consulting firm behind that name had been active for 9 years and had a functional website and 3 genuine client testimonials from companies that had employed her briefly and in a different capacity. And the business cards in her coat pocket were the same ones she'd used in 3 other European cities in 3 other operational windows, and they'd never caused a problem. The customs agent looked at the passport and looked at her face and stamped it and said something in German that meant have a good visit. She took the S-Bahn into the city, sat facing the door in a window seat. The train ran above ground through the eastern districts before it descended, and in those minutes above ground, she had the November sky and the flat gray of the city underneath it, the construction cranes and the low buildings and the specific way Berlin looked in early morning in November, like a city that had not quite decided whether to be beautiful. The buildings from the East German period sat adjacent to new glass, and the new glass sat adjacent to pre-war stone. Nothing matched. Nothing was meant to. A city that had been split in half for 30 years and was still, 40 years later, working out which half it had been. The woman across the aisle had a child in a carrier on her chest, asleep. The child's face turned sideways against her collarbone. She watched the city the same way Renn watched it, without apparent interest, her eyes moving across the window at the same pace as the city moving past it. She watched the city through the window, and her face didn't move. Her hotel was on Rosenthaler Strasse, 3 minutes from Alexanderplatz on foot, and 300 meters from the red brick tower of a pre-war department store that was now a mall with a food court on the ground floor. Not listed in any tourist publication. Not the kind of hotel that had a website with professional photography. The lobby had a breakfast counter and a television mounted in the upper corner on a metal bracket, a news channel with the sound off. A single person behind the desk. He handed her a key card and said checkout was at 11 and asked if she needed a wake-up call in German, and she said no thank you in German and took the stairs. Her room was on the 4th floor. The window faced the back of the building. A narrow alley, a row of bins, the back wall of a residential block with light in 2 windows, a kitchen visible through a half-lowered blind, and one other room where a paper star hung in the glass, still lit from the night before, a child's lamp still burning at 8:03 a.m. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked away. She set her bag on the chair beside the bed and did not unpack it. She opened the outer pocket and confirmed the contents she was already certain were there. The photograph in its folded envelope, the chip from AB7 in its small hard case, both present. She closed the pocket and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall. 4 days. The address in Prenzlauer Berg was an apartment on Rendsche Strasse, 4th floor, northwest-facing windows, registered to a logistics consulting operation that the ICD had flagged 18 months ago as a MERIDIAN support structure, not primary infrastructure. Secondary, the kind of address that handled local coordination, the communication relays and safe passage arrangements and administrative work that any operational presence required. The ICD had 3 similar addresses in 3 European cities, and they were all active simultaneously, all doing the same thing, verifying, checking that specific people were where they were supposed to be and doing what they were supposed to be doing. The ICD had been running the same accelerated internal maintenance since the signal was decoded, and MERIDIAN, based on this sweep, was also running it. That was the picture she was here to confirm. She had 4 days to confirm it fully and come back with something that didn't leave the ICD guessing at what MERIDIAN acceleration meant. No close assignment, no target, intelligence work. On day 1, she did nothing active. She walked. Berlin in November required a coat and she brought one, dark wool, nothing distinctive. She walked from the hotel to Alexanderplatz and through the plaza past the world clock, which she'd seen in documentation but not in person. And it was different in person, large and specific and surrounded by tourists who were sparse in November, mostly couples, a school group that had been cold for a long time and was showing it. She moved through the plaza without stopping and north through Mitt, past the brick and steel of the television tower that dominated the eastern skyline, and eventually northeast into Prenzlauer Berg, where she didn't approach Esredske Strasse but moved through the surrounding streets in a loose grid that took 90 minutes. She was noting traffic patterns, transit stops, the natural sight lines in each block. Prenzlauer Berg had gentrified aggressively and completely. The architecture was largely pre-war. The wide-fronted residential buildings with their high ceilings and elaborate cornices, and the internal courtyards behind iron gates. The ground floors were coffee shops and wine bars and organic grocery stores and restaurants that served small plates from blackboards and had names like single words that didn't quite describe anything. In 1985, it had been a district for artists and dissidents and people who needed cheap rent, and who had developed in that specific pressure an art scene and a music scene, and a particular culture of productive neglect. In 2024, it was expensive and self-conscious, and the people with laptops in the cafes were freelancers who worked for companies that didn't have offices and who communicated primarily through applications that hadn't existed 10 years ago. There were strollers. There were very specific dogs on very specific leads. There were people who looked like they'd been here long enough to have opinions about which bakery had changed. The Esredske Strasse apartment sat in the middle of all of it, and the cover of a logistics consulting firm worked because the neighborhood was full of people who ran businesses that didn't quite require explanation. She ate lunch at a place on Karlwitzstrasse that had tables outside despite the cold, a long bench under a gas heater with blankets folded on each chair. She ordered soup and coffee and ate with her back to the building, and watched the street while she did it and thought about nothing in particular and let the city come in. In the afternoon, she took the U2 back toward the center and spent 3 hours in her hotel room going through the ICD's documentation on the 3 cities. 14 personnel files, 8 active adjacent assets, people who weren't ICD personnel but who existed in a zone of adjacency, who done contract work or published relevant research or held positions that made them occasional indirect relay points for ICD operational infrastructure. 3 confirmed MERIDIAN operational addresses. She'd read the documentation twice on the plane. She'd read it a 3rd time now, and made notes in the shorthand she'd developed across several years of this kind of work. A notation system that looked like a disorganized to-do list and functioned as a map. 9:00 p.m. She called in from the room. "I'm in," she said. "Confirmed. Status at 48 hours. 11 seconds. She set the phone on the nightstand and lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling. There was a water stain in one corner shaped roughly like Denmark. She stared at it for a while. The building around her settled in the way old buildings settled in cold weather. The heating came on with a low metallic sound that repeated approximately every 40 minutes. She slept at 10:30 p.m. and woke without an alarm at 5:50 a.m. Day 2 was active. She was in the area around Esredske Strasse by 7:45 a.m. She couldn't station herself on the street itself, because a woman standing still on a residential block in the cold for any extended period would register, particularly on a street with this density of human observation. The neighborhood was dense, lived in, full of people who knew their streets. She ran a loop instead, covering the 2 primary approach routes. The U2 stop at Eberswalder Strasse was one natural approach vector to the address. The intersection of Esredske Strasse and Danziger Strasse was another, coming from the south. She walked both in the morning pedestrian traffic and then found a position at a cafe on Castanianallee. Castanianallee was one of the main arteries through the neighborhood, a wide street lined with chestnut trees that had dropped their leaves, but still had the skeleton look of something that would be substantial in summer. The cafe had been there long enough for the furniture to accumulate a dented and patched quality, chairs reinforced with metal brackets that didn't quite match the original hardware. A glass case near the counter held pastries, and the machine behind it, was an old commercial unit that steamed louder than it needed to. She sat at a table near the window and ordered a coffee and watched the entrance of the side street that connected to the Rosenthaler Strasse approach. 2 hours she sat there. She counted 4 people using the approach route in the direction of Rosenthaler Strasse. 2 were clearly residential, in the rhythm of a morning commute, coats and bags, and the pace of people who knew exactly how much time they had. 1 carried a laptop bag and turned off 2 blocks before the address. 1 was a woman in her early 40s who moved at the pace of someone with a specific destination and turned the correct direction. Renn watched her until she turned a corner and didn't come back, possibly nothing. Early days. She ordered a second coffee and read the paper she'd bought at a kiosk outside the U-Bahn and didn't read it, not in any way that retained information, while her eyes moved over it. The street, the cafe entrance, the side street opening, the Volkswagen that had been parked outside since she'd arrived, the couple at the next table inside having a conversation in German that had the cadence of a disagreement that had been going on for some time and had evolved into a kind of comfortable deadlock. She left at 10:15 a.m. the U2 to Nollendorfplatz and ate lunch at a Turkish place near the square, a counter with 4 stools and a menu written on a chalkboard that wasn't changed because it didn't need to be changed. She ate quickly and paid and sat for another 10 minutes with a tea she didn't want, running the morning in her head. The MERIDIAN footprint was consistent with the documentation, which meant the documentation was good, which meant ICD's monitoring of the Rosenthaler Strasse address had been accurate and complete. No surprises from the infrastructure side. She'd been hoping there were no surprises from the infrastructure side. The assets were the variable she needed to run this afternoon, and the assets were where MERIDIAN verification interest would be concentrated. And if MERIDIAN verification of the assets was complete, then the picture was close to complete, and she could call it in on day 3 and be back in transit on day 4. The afternoon she spent running the assets. 3 people in Berlin that the documentation flagged as adjacent. A retired communications specialist in Neukölln who'd done contract work for an ICD-adjacent defense contractor 12 years ago, work involving encrypted relay systems, and who had since lived a quiet retirement that the ICD monitored with a low-intensity passive watch. A researcher at Freie Universität whose published work on distributed signal analysis had flagged for ICD relevance in 2019, and who had never been contacted, and never would be most likely, but whose presence in the monitoring ledger made her a potential MERIDIAN verification target. An embassy logistics coordinator whose daily work involved a shipping channel that the ICD used as an indirect relay point for certain kinds of routine data movement, though the coordinator didn't know this, had never been told, was simply a person who handled the correct kind of paperwork through the correct kind of organization, and whose continued presence in that role mattered. She didn't approach any of them. Confirmation of presence was the objective. She confirmed the retired specialist outside his building in Neukölln at 2:15 p.m. Walking a small dog through the cold, empty street, his coat collar turned up and his posture expressing a complete lack of interest in anything except the dog and the pavement and the state of the weather, which was the posture of someone who had nothing in their present to concern them. She confirmed the researcher through the university's public directory, which listed office hours at 3:00 p.m. and showed the office number on a campus map that was available to anyone who wanted it. She confirmed the embassy logistics coordinator's pattern at 2 of the 3 points the documentation mapped. The morning coffee at a place near Unter den Linden that the coordinator apparently went to every working day without variation, and the route to the parking structure at the end of the workday, which she caught the tail end of at 5:40 p.m. from a position across the street. The coordinator was a woman in her 50s who walked with a purposeful stride and carried a specific large canvas bag that the file had noted, and that was present green canvas, worn at the corners. She crossed Bayernstrasse heading south and didn't look up. She had no idea. She was going to her car, and then she was going home, and she was going to do this again tomorrow, and the day after, and she had no frame for understanding that her unremarkable job had an unremarkable component that was watched at a distance by people who would never introduce themselves. All present, all apparently unaware. The Newkern stop on the U8 smelled of something fried from a street stand near the exit, and the platform had the acoustic quality of deep tile, the sounds arriving flat and contained. She took it back toward Alexanderplatz and got off 2 stops early and walked the rest of the way. She took the U8 back toward Alexanderplatz and walked the last stretch to the hotel in the dark. It was 6:30 p.m., and dark meant dark. November this far north meant the light was gone by 4:30, and by 6:30 the streets were running on lamp posts and shop fronts and the glow from restaurant windows. She walked through it with her hands in her pockets. The Alexanderplatz area at this hour was people heading home, the transit plaza busy and purposeful, the square itself stripped of the tourist foot traffic that gave it a different quality in daylight. She walked past the entrance to the hotel twice before going in, not from inattention, but from a habit she developed long enough ago that it operated below the level of decision. 2 loops, no one following. She sat at the small desk in the hotel room with the notepad and the shorthand notation and went through the day. She crossed out confirmed items and circled open threads and added 2 new threads in the margins, and then sat back and looked at what she'd written. Something from the morning loop. She'd been dismissing it since noon, and she dismissed it enough times now that she needed to take the dismissal seriously, examine it, see if it held. On the approach to Rosenthaler Strasse, she'd seen a man in a gray coat. She'd noted him because she noted everyone in the vicinity of the approach, and she put him down as a commuter because his pace matched it, and he'd been moving in a direction consistent with someone going to the transit stop. But he'd been on the platform at street level when she came up from underground, which put him at the exit 40 seconds after she'd have expected him, and then at the far end of Castellinelli at 10:08 a.m. 7 minutes after she'd left the cafe, she'd passed a man in a gray coat going in the opposite direction. She looked at this for a long time, probably nothing. The coat wasn't distinctive. The platform position had a reasonable explanation. 40 seconds was close enough to expected that she'd have to stretch to make it significant, but she'd noticed it twice, and her noticing things twice was a signal she'd learned to take seriously. And the 2 noticing events were geographically and temporally positioned consistent with a particular kind of surveillance pattern, if someone had been running one. She wrote it in the margin with a question mark and called it in at 8:45 p.m. Day 2, she said. Assets confirmed. Meridian footprint consistent with documentation. Pattern is verification, not extraction or recruitment. 1 loose thread I'm not ready to call. Confirm at 72 hours, the voice said. She lay on the bed with the lights on until 11:00 p.m. and then turned them off and slept in the clothes she'd been wearing all day. Day 3 she ran the loose thread first. She was at the S-Bahn stop before 7:00 a.m. and ran variations on the previous day's routes, approaching each position from a different direction, timing each segment slightly off from her previous day's timing. She ran an hour of this in the November dark, the city not quite awake yet, the bakeries just opening and the first transit crowds thin and deliberate. No gray coat. She extended the search radius and ran 2 additional routes she hadn't used yet, cutting through blocks she hadn't covered, checking the transit stops on the parallel streets. She stopped for coffee at a place on Rosenthaler Strasse that had just opened and stood at the counter and drank it and watched the street through the window for 15 minutes. Nothing she could name. The coat wasn't there, or the person behind the coat had switched methods, or the coat had been nothing, and the morning was going to confirm that. She spent the morning telling herself it was nothing. The afternoon told her otherwise, running the perimeter of the Rosenthaler Strasse block at 2:30 p.m. when she saw the woman, standing at the corner of Rosenthaler Strasse and the unnamed alley that ran between the residential blocks to the east, which was a position with a partial line of sight on the building's front entrance. The woman was in her late 30s or early 40s. Dark coat, sensible boots, a bag that could have held anything or nothing. She stood the way someone stood when they were reading a phone, except she wasn't looking at a phone. She stood with her right hand resting on the strap of the bag and her chin very slightly up, not reading anything, looking at a distance. 4 minutes. Renn counted from a position in the mid-block, looking at a window display in a shop that sold home goods, standing with the body language of someone who'd stopped without purpose and hadn't quite decided to move on. Then the woman walked away in the direction of Rosenthaler Strasse, a pace that didn't change and didn't accelerate, and the body language was exactly what it had been while she was standing, which was neutral and completely controlled. Renn walked in the opposite direction and didn't hurry. She found a coffee shop 2 blocks north, a narrow place with 2 tables inside and a counter and a handwritten menu taped to the wall. She sat at the counter and ordered an Americano she didn't want and drank half of it and thought about the gray coat and the woman. The gray coat and the woman weren't connected to the MERIDIAN operational footprint. She was confident in this now. The MERIDIAN footprint was oriented toward the assets and toward the verification pattern, and she'd mapped it across 2 days, and it didn't extend to Renn's own movements in the neighborhood. MERIDIAN wasn't watching her. Someone was watching her, someone who moved professionally and held positions consistent with trained surveillance, but that someone was running a separate operation that was oriented toward Renn specifically rather than toward anything MERIDIAN was doing. The methods were slightly wrong. This was the thing she couldn't articulate fully and had been turning over since the gray coat. Professional patience. Good position selection. The gray coat's timing at Rosenthaler Strasse had been close enough to right that she'd nearly dismissed it. The woman's position on the corner had been defensible, but the approach geometry and the duration and the choices they were making didn't fit any operational profile she could name with certainty. Not IT. She was sure of that. Not any of the Western European services she had extensive experience with. Not American in any way she recognized. She sat with a half cup of coffee and looked at the counter, which had the black rubber anti-fatigue matting that all such counters had, and let the list of things it wasn't clarify the thing it was. The operation was oriented specifically toward her. Someone had assessed her presence in the city early enough to set surveillance in place before she was actively running work. That required knowing she was coming or identifying her very fast at the airport, both of which implied a specific kind of capability and a specific kind of interest, not the capability of an improvised response to an unexpected situation, the capability of someone who'd been prepared. MERIDIAN had sent someone to watch her watch them. She walked back toward the hotel and let the city pass around her. The U2 stop at Rosenthaler Strasse was full of the late afternoon rush, people streaming down from the street level to the platform. The smell of wet coats and the specific close warmth of a transit car packed in November. She found a seat and sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the floor and let the train carry her west. Back in the hotel, she spent 2 hours going through the documentation, looking for anything she'd missed about MERIDIAN European operational capacity. Anything that would indicate they ran parallel assessment operations alongside their primary sweeps. She found nothing she didn't already know. This was itself informative. It meant MERIDIAN was doing something the ICD's records didn't anticipate, which meant either the ICD's intelligence on MERIDIAN was incomplete in a specific way, or MERIDIAN had developed this capacity recently and the record hadn't caught up. Neither answer was comfortable. She called in at 8:00 p.m. Day 3, she said. MERIDIAN sweep confirmed as internal verification matching our own acceleration pattern. Separate thread. I may have a shadow, not MERIDIAN primary operation. Methods don't match any profile I have. Possibly MERIDIAN secondary running assessment of my assessment. A longer pause than usual. Can you confirm? By end of day 4, if I'm right, I'll have a face for you. Proceed, the voice said. Day 4 she found Sokolova. She spent the morning working the problem, not running the Rosenthaler Strasse area, not running the assets, not doing any of the work that had generated the surveillance attention. She ran a completely different set of routes through Mitte and Wedding, nowhere near Prenzlauer Berg, routes designed to reveal a shadow rather than accomplish anything else. She moved at varying pace, irregular stops, twice doubled back on herself with a plausible explanation in her body language. A glance at a cafe, a change of direction that read as indecision. Wedding was a different Berlin from Prenzlauer Berg. Less self-conscious, less expensive, the storefronts practical, the street-level businesses the kind that served the neighborhood rather than performing for it. A hardware store, a place that repaired appliances, a pharmacy. She walked through it in the morning cold and watched her own reflection in shop windows and watched everyone around her in the glass without looking at anyone directly. No shadow she could identify, which said one of three things. The shadow was better than the gray coat, and the woman on the corner had suggested, or the shadow had switched personnel to someone she hadn't been sensitized to, or they were holding back and waiting for her to return to operational territory where they had their positions set. She'd done this work 41 times. The count was exact. She kept it the same way some people kept track of significant events, and others kept track of distances run. Not for anyone else, just because the number needed to live somewhere. It had its own place in the same interior space as the chip and the photograph and the gradient file from Farside Station she hadn't reported, the stable anomaly. Continuous reading she'd looked at twice on a screen in a room on the far side of the moon, and then closed without filing. The accumulation was getting specific. She knew that. She'd been noting it the way you note a pressure change, the kind you register in the body before the sky confirms it, not with alarm, just with attention. A sandwich from a Turkish counter near the wedding U-Bahn stop and ate it standing at the counter and thought about these three options, and decided the third was most likely because it was most consistent with what she'd seen of their approach so far. Patient, committed to established positions, a surveillance operation built around coverage of where she was going rather than moving with her. Back to Prenzlauer Berg at noon, the familiar perimeter worked differently this time. She wasn't looking at the MERIDIAN footprint. She was looking for a second layer of operational presence, a coverage position that wasn't oriented toward Rosenthaler Strasse or toward the assets, but that would provide coverage of the approaches and exits Renn herself was most likely to use. She identified 3 candidate positions on the map before she went out and moved toward them with the kind of patience this work required. The patience that meant stopping for a coffee, reading a newspaper for 20 minutes, walking an indirect route, letting 20 minutes become 30, letting 30 become 40. The first candidate position was a doorway with a sightline on Danziger Strasse. Nothing when she reached it. A bench at the small park on Strasburger Strasse was the second. Nothing. A side street off Lichener Strasse was the third that had parking for 8 vehicles and a partial sightline on the Castanianallee approach corridor. She found it by coming at it from the west, from a direction that put her in a position to look down the side street from a cross intersection rather than entering it. And she stood at the cross intersection for 4 minutes looking at the side street like someone who'd slightly lost track of where they were. The gray Volkswagen was parked 3 vehicles from the end. Driver's side window fogged from sustained occupancy. A woman in the driver's seat with a coffee held in her right hand. Her gaze aimed at the approach corridor and not at the cross intersection where Renn was standing. Late 30s, short dark hair. The coat she wore in the car was not visible in full, but the collar was visible, and the collar was the kind of thing someone wore when they hadn't wanted the coat to announce itself. She sat the way someone sat when they were working. Still, but a particular kind of still. Coffee held and raised to the mouth at intervals with a regularity that suggested the intervals were conscious. Her eyes moved at a rhythm, and the rhythm was the rhythm of someone running a scan across a defined field. Renn stood at the cross intersection for 2 minutes, long enough to be certain. Then she walked away and turned north and found a different route back toward Mitte. She spent 2 hours on what she did next. She needed the right kind of space, visible enough to be clearly public, contained enough that a conversation at normal register stayed contained. She ran 3 cafes before she found the one she wanted. A place on Rosenthaler Strasse in the heart of Mitte that had been operating long enough to acquire a patina of use, the furniture worn and reinforced, the walls hung with things that had been there for years and had achieved a kind of settled permanence. Quiet enough on a Thursday in November that the tables had separation between them, a corner table in the back with sight lines to the door and the street window. She sat down at 2:15 p.m. and ordered 2 coffees. Neither cup was examined while she waited. The wall, the window, the door. She looked at the window. She looked at the door when it opened and noted who came through. She'd expected perhaps 15 minutes. She got 11. The woman from the Volkswagen came through the door at 2:26 p.m. without looking around, without the scan she'd have done if she hadn't already assessed the space from outside. She walked to the corner table with the directness of someone who'd already made a decision about what came next and sat down across from Renn and looked at the two cups on the table. She picked up one of them and drank. Neither of them said anything. Then the woman set the cup down. "You ordered already." Her English was clean and nearly accent-free, and she'd chosen English the way someone chose a language they decided long ago was the right language for this category of conversation, the way it became a tool rather than a mother tongue. "You took longer than I expected," Renn said. "I stopped for cigarettes." She set the coffee down. "I don't smoke." The cafe had 5 other occupied tables, none of them close to the corner. The music was low, instrumental, the kind of sound a space uses to give conversations the coverage they needed without being obviously for that purpose. "Vera Sokolova," Renn said. The woman's jaw didn't change. Nothing in her hands changed. "You have a file, we have a file. We also have a file." Sokolova looked at the coffee cup and then at Renn. "Yours is more detailed. We noted that specifically when we assessed the content difference. Your organization keeps better records of people like me than mine keeps of people like you." "It's a resource question," Renn said. "Probably." Sokolova turned the cup 90 degrees on the table and turned it back. "Or a philosophy question. Ours doesn't see the individual as the relevant unit. Better record-keeping follows from caring more about the individual. It's a question of which model of operational security you find more useful. Both have problems." Renn waited. "You've been on me since day one," she said. "Since the airport, yes. Airport identification. We had advance notice," Sokolova said. "Not from inside your organization, from an external trigger. The same external trigger your organization presumably used to send you here." She held the coffee without drinking it. "The verification pattern. We knew you detected our sweep and would send someone. We knew the kind of someone your organization sends for this kind of assessment. The profile is distinctive enough that airport identification was feasible with sufficient lead time. So MERIDIAN had detected ICD's detection. The two programs had been watching each other, and both had been doing it deliberately and presumably for a long time. You've been cataloging ICD operational profiles since the beginning, as have you." Sokolova said this without inflection, as pure statement. "We've been maintaining this non-relationship for a very long time, and maintaining it actively requires a certain quality of information about the other party. We know what your investigators look like when they work. We know the approach geometry and the timing patterns and the way someone builds a picture of an operational environment. You fit the profile well. I'll take that as a compliment." "It is one." Sokolova looked at her. She had the kind of eyes that didn't take long to assess something and then moved on, and the assessment had already been filed before the conversation started. "4 days is faster than we expected. We thought we had another day at minimum." "The position on Rosenthaler Strasse was good," Renn said. "The coverage logic was right. The fogged window was the thing." A brief pause. "Noted. The November light through the front window was the specific quality of light this far north in this month. Flat and precise and without warmth. It lit the street outside sharply, every surface detailed, every shadow defined, and gave everything a look of clear and careful visibility that had nothing generous in it." Renn picked up her coffee. "Tell me about the sweep." Sokolova was quiet for a moment in the way someone was quiet when they were deciding what to give. "It matches yours," she said. "The pattern matches, accelerated verification, internal maintenance, ensuring that everything in our operational environment is where we need it to be and functioning correctly. We've been running it at this pace since we decoded our signal," which was when? 4 years ago, though we had it for 11 years before that, the same general frame as yours. Renn said nothing. "We know about your signal," Sokolova said. "Not the content, the existence. The ICD decoded a transmission 4 years after we did, and has been operating under elevated internal maintenance since that date. We've been watching the behavioral signature. It's the same as ours." She picked up the coffee. "Your organization is doing exactly what mine is doing, which means we are both responding to the same kind of information, which means the information is structurally similar if not identical. That is not a coincidence in any useful sense of the word." "It isn't," Renn said. "No." Sokolova set the cup down. She looked at the table between them for a moment. When she looked back up, her voice had a quality that was the same precision as before, but with something underneath it that hadn't been there, something that had nothing to do with the professional register of the conversation. "Our date," she said, "is different from yours." Renn's hands were in her lap. She didn't move them. "Different how?" she said. "Later, 8 months after yours, to the day." Sokolova held Renn's eyes. "We ran the analysis 4 times with different teams. The error margin on the date is less than 2 weeks. Whatever variance exists in the date calculation, the 8-month differential is not a product of that variance. It's structural." She paused. "Our analysts spent several months working out what that differential meant. The conclusion they reached, and I'm telling you this is the consensus of the most senior analytical capacity in our organization, is that the same source sent both signals, and that the source sent them in a deliberate sequence. The music in the cafe, low and instrumental and continuous. A couple near the front in conversation, their heads close together. The man at the counter ordering something. The city through the window doing what the city did. It knew about both programs," Renn said, "and addressed them separately. Your date first. Ours 8 months later. Whatever is coming sent your organization a message and then sent ours a message in order with a specific interval between them. That is not the behavior of something that doesn't understand the difference between us." Sokolova let this sit. "It understood that we don't coordinate. It communicated with us separately anyway. It understood the structure of how we exist in relation to each other and accounted for that structure when it decided how to address us. The implications of this sat in the space between them at the corner table." "You're telling me this," Renn said. "Not running an operation, not using it to gain something. Telling me." "Yes." "Why?" Sokolova looked at the window and then back at Renn. She considered the question, as though she'd asked it of herself already, and had arrived at an answer she was prepared to give. "Because the information is more dangerous sitting only in my organization's hands. Information held by only one program is a liability for both programs. If your organization doesn't know that we received a signal, and that the date differs from yours, and that the signals were sent in deliberate sequence, then your organization is working with an incomplete picture of what is happening. An incomplete picture produces bad operational decisions." She said this cleanly, without emphasis. "And because I've watched you work for 4 days, I've assessed you. You're the same as me, built by a different machine for the same purpose by different people who never spoke. I've made a judgment that you're someone who will do something useful with this information. What does useful mean to you in this context?" Sokolova didn't answer directly. Her hand stayed still on the table. "It means that the information gets where it needs to go." She looked at her coffee, which is somewhere beyond the two of us in this cafe. A tram ran on Rosenthaler Strasse outside, its sound moving through the wall as a low vibration and then gone. The November afternoon outside had started its early collapse into dark. It wasn't 4:00 p.m. yet, and the light in the street was already losing its directness and taking on the gray-brown of evening. "There are others," Renn said. "Programs, the Chinese, the British, others. Yes, you know about them. We know about some of them. We have assessed with reasonable confidence that at least 2 of them have also received signals. Different signals, presumably, different dates." Sokolova's voice stayed flat. "If we're correct, then there are multiple programs, multiple dates, multiple signals, all from the same source. All in a sequence we don't have the complete picture of. We have our date. You have yours. We don't know where either of us falls in the sequence." Renn thought about this. She thought about the gradient file at Farside Station Alpha and the reading that had been running without interruption for longer than the instrumentation had been active. She thought about what that implied about who had been in that part of the solar system before the ICD's installations arrived. "You had something else," Renn said. Sokolova looked at her. "Before the signal information, you were leading towards something. You said the word sequence and then you paused, and you came at the meridian date information from a different angle than you'd have used if that was the primary thing. There's something else." The pause Sokolova took before answering was measurable and deliberate. She was deciding. Her jaw moved slightly and stopped, and her hand stayed still, and she looked at Renn with an assessment that was the same assessment she'd probably been running since the airport. "Before the signals," she said, and her voice changed register, not dramatically, just enough that the shift was present. The professional precision was still there, but underneath it was something that hadn't been fully processed, which on a person like Sokolova meant it was something she'd had for some time and had been unable to put down. There is a document in our archive from 1962, a field report from the operative who ran our primary recovery operation at Kapustin Yar in 1948. Not the initial recovery. A secondary examination conducted in 1962 when the primary technology analysis was largely complete. They were doing a final inventory of material they'd set aside and hadn't fully classified. Renn waited. One item in the secondary inventory was described as an interior panel from the recovered craft, not a functional component. Our analysts in 1948 had set it aside because it didn't appear to have mechanical or electronic relevance. In 1962, the operative doing the secondary examination noticed something on the panel surface, an inscription. Sokolova set the coffee down with careful precision, placing it exactly. Not an accidental feature of the surface material, not damage, something put there intentionally, something meant to be found and read. Your linguists worked it for 9 years, 1963 to 1972. Intermittent, not primary, they had other priorities. The inscription was in nothing they could map to any known or proto-language family. They were working from structural analysis, looking for patterns rather than vocabulary. Sokolova paused. What they concluded, and there is a consensus report from 1972 that is the highest classification our organization has, is that the inscription is a sequence, a series of what they interpreted as counts, individual values arranged in a progression, 14 values in the sequence. Renn's breathing was even. She was making it even. The values themselves weren't the primary finding, Sokolova said. Our analysts spent years on the values and reached no conclusions about their specific meaning. The primary finding was structural. The sequence had a direction, a progression from a larger value toward a smaller value, 14 steps down. She looked at the table. The last value in the sequence is a count of 1. 1 what? Renn said. Our analysts interpreted it as a number of remaining instances, a count of what was left. Sokolova looked up. The question they couldn't answer, and which the 1972 report leaves explicitly unresolved, was remaining instances of what? Renn said nothing. In 2019, a junior analyst working on unrelated archival materials requested the 1972 report for cross-reference purposes. She read the sequence. She read the 14 values. She looked at the last value and wrote a 2-paragraph notation that is now attached to the bottom of the 1972 report. Sokolova's voice was completely flat. The notation points out that the sequence is a countdown, not a count. The direction of the progression and the terminal value of 1 are consistent with a countdown to a specific event. The event is the arrival of the final instance. She paused, and the notation observes that if the inscription was made in 1947, and if the count has been running down at a consistent rate, the last instance is approximately now. The cafe, the music, low and continuous. The other tables, ordinary, a Thursday afternoon in a November city. She was wrong about one thing, Sokolova said. The inscription wasn't made in 1947. Our materials analysis ran in 1974, and the report from that analysis is also in the archive. The surface the inscription is on is old. Not old in the sense of decades. Old in the sense that our materials analysts used language in the 1974 report that was careful to avoid being specific, because the implications of being specific were ones they weren't prepared to put in writing. She looked at Renn. The inscription is not a recent document. Renn's hands were in her lap. She looked at Sokolova. The count was never about humanity's technology, Sokolova said. Our analysts assumed it was because that's what the program was oriented toward. Recovered technology, accelerated development, first contact preparation. They read the count through that lens. The 2019 notation reads it differently. A pause. The count is about how many times we've done this. Approached the same threshold from the same starting point. Built our way back to the same level. Drawn the same attention. The last count in the sequence, Sokolova said, Is 1. She stood up. She pulled her coat from the back of the chair and stood and picked up her bag, and she looked at Renn once briefly, with the kind of look that didn't need to hold because it had already communicated what it was going to communicate. And then she walked to the door with the same unhurried, deliberate pace she'd arrived with. The door opened. She went out onto Rosenthaler Strasse. Renn watched her through the window. She turned north and walked and was gone. The 2 coffee cups on the table, same order, both of them. Renn looked at them. 1. She sat with it. She sat with it the way she sat with the photograph, the way she sat with the data chip from AB7 and the fragment of Petra Malone's notes, the way she'd been carrying things since Detroit without fully deciding what to do with them. The photograph was in the inside pocket of her jacket. She didn't touch it. The gradient file. Farside Station Alpha. Stable anomaly. Continuous. A reading that had been running without interruption since before the ICD's instrumentation arrived, which meant before the ICD's presence in that part of the solar system, which meant whatever produced the reading had been there first. She hadn't reported it. She'd been carrying it. Sokolova's words. The count is about how many times we've done this. Entire institutional logic rested on an assumption she had never examined because no one had ever examined it, because the assumption was so foundational that questioning it would require questioning everything above it. The assumption was that humanity was ascending, building its way towards something it hadn't yet reached. The recovered technology, the solar installations, the accelerated development. All of it rested on the idea that humanity was on its way up, that the alien presence represented something ahead of humanity on a trajectory humanity was climbing. What the inscription said was that the trajectory had a different shape, not a line, a loop, something that arrived at the same point repeatedly from the same direction, built to the same height, and had done it enough times that someone had carved a count into a panel in 1947 or much earlier, had placed the count where it would be found when someone reached a specific level of capability, had made it readable by people who hadn't existed yet. 14 values. The last one was 1. Not the first time, not the second. A number of prior instances she didn't have, and that the inscription hadn't provided, and that she wasn't sure she wanted. The gradient reading at Farside was continuous. It had been running before humanity was in that part of the solar system. Something had been there. Something that was still there, still running, still producing the reading, patient in a way that fit the scale of a count that ran from 14 down to 1. She didn't know yet what she would do with this. She knew she would do something. She'd been accumulating these things. The photograph, the chip, the gradient file, and now the inscription and the second signal and the count of 1. Each thing connected to the others in ways she could see the edges of but hadn't yet assembled into a shape she could hold all at once. She'd been working at it in the margins of every assignment since Detroit. This was one more piece, the largest piece yet. She picked up her phone and called in. "I have the picture," she said. "Report. Meridian sweep matches ours in pattern, scale, and acceleration timeline. They decoded their own signal 4 years ago. Their date is 8 months after ours to the day. Same source. The source sent the signals in sequence and addressed both programs separately. It understood the distinction between the programs when it sent them. It addressed us differently and deliberately." She paused. "The Meridian senior operative I met with assessed that at least 2 other programs have also received signals. The ICD's date may not be first in the sequence. We don't have the full picture." A pause on the other end. When the voice responded, it had the quality of something being received and processed at a level above what would appear in the call record. "The source sent both signals. Yes. Confirm the 8-month differential. Meridian analytical consensus. Multiple passes. Their certainty is high." Another pause. "Report on the meeting. A senior operative. She initiated contact. I ran her to ground on day 4. She made a judgment to share the information because she assessed it as too dangerous to hold unilaterally." Renn looked at the 2 coffee cups. "She's correct. Return authorization confirmed. 24-hour window. Understood." She ended the call. The cafe was doing what cafes did at 3:52 p.m. on a Thursday in November in a city that had been carrying its own weight for 100 years. A couple near the front had their heads together over something on a laptop. The man who'd been at the counter was gone. The woman at the wall table was writing in a notebook with the completeness of someone who'd found the thing she'd been trying to say. Renn sat with the 2 coffee cups. Same order, same table. The worn surface of the table had ring marks from years of other cups, and she was adding 2 more now, and in a week those marks would be indistinguishable from the rest. She hadn't reported the inscription. She'd reported the signal differential and the sequence and the other programs. She'd reported everything that the ICD needed to act on. What she hadn't reported was the count. The 14 values counting down to 1. The materials analysis saying the surface age was something the 1974 analysts hadn't been willing to specify in writing. The junior analyst in 2019 who'd looked at the terminal value and understood what it meant. She didn't know yet why she was keeping it. She'd been keeping things since Detroit without fully understanding the logic of the keeping, and the logic was accumulating its own shape, and she wasn't ready to look at the shape directly yet. What she knew: the gradient file at Farside Station Alpha had been running since before the ICD was there. The photograph in her pocket was a family in coordinated Burgundy who no longer existed because of a decision she'd made and had made correctly and was carrying anyway. The data chip had a single line of text from Petra Malone's notes that she'd read twice and hadn't deleted, and the count was 1. She left enough cash on the table to cover both coffees. She stood and put on her coat and buttoned it to the top and looked at the table one more time. The 2 cups, the worn surface, the ring marks that would outlast this afternoon by years. Then she turned and walked to the door and out onto Rosenthaler Strasse. Berlin in November at 4:00 p.m. was the specific moment when the day gave up. The light that had been flat and precise all afternoon was going gray at the edges, losing its directness, the shadows extending and losing definition at the same time. The street ran both directions in the cold. A tram was running somewhere to the north, its sound moving through the buildings and arriving diminished. Foot traffic in both directions, people with their collars up and their hands in their pockets, and the brisk purpose of people who were moving from one warm place toward another. She stood for a moment on the pavement with the door of the cafe closing behind her. MERIDIAN had a signal. Their date came after hers. The source had addressed both programs. The source had understood enough about both programs to address them separately, to sequence the messages, to account for the fact that the 2 organizations existed in careful non-relation to each other and would need to be reached individually. Whatever was coming, it had known about them both. It had been patient about it. The inscription said that humanity had done this before, had built its way back up to this point more than once, had been at this threshold before and had not, based on the existence of the inscription and the existence of the program and the existence of the signal and the countdown that had reached its last value, come through it intact in any form she wanted to think about too directly. The last count was 1. She walked north toward Hackescher Markt and the S-Bahn. Her flight left Tegel at 7:10 a.m. She had the rest of today and the evening and the night. She'd eat something and go through the report once more, and check the documentation and sleep if she could and be at the airport before 5:30 a.m. The city around her did what it had been doing all week, which was exist in its specific November texture. The cold, the long building facades with their decades of different architectures stacked against each other, the lights coming on in the windows as the dark came down. A city that knew what it was to be divided, a city that had spent 30 years maintaining a non-relationship with itself, parallel programs on parallel streets, people with the same language and the same history separated by a wall and a set of institutional decisions, and a long patient maintenance of careful distance. The wall was gone. The distance had not entirely resolved. She walked. The S-Bahn stop was 4 minutes ahead and her flight was in the morning, and the count was 1 and she walked. And behind her, the cafe on Rosenthaler Strasse sat with 2 empty cups on a corner table, and the November dark coming down outside the window, and the city doing what the city always did, which was continue.